Alright, welcome back again. This is Denizen Scripting Tutorials, and I'm going to cover another one tonight before I go to bed. As a request from McMonkey, I'm going to cover world events. It's a completely different concept. We haven't really touched on any of it in previous videos. So, I think it's a really relevant one. A lot of people have questions about them and how they work. So I'm going to cover a basic one. And if I get really ambitious the next time we get into video making, I might elaborate on some other examples. But the basic idea of what a world event is, actually, it's called a world script. There's a script type, it's called a world script. So we're going to make an example world, caps lock is on. Example world script. And what a world script is a list of world events, which are chunks of code that are fired when things happen in the game. If you just came from watching the listener videos, don't think of it at all like a listener in the sense of in the way we used them previously, because they are different even though they have similarities. So they're type world, and then you have your list of events. So we're going to start. We're going to start off with a really basic event, and it's called on entity death. So this event fires every time any entity dies. So it is as simple as putting some script in that says, entity died. So every time anything in the game is killed, in the chat, an entity died will be narrated. That's the very basics of it. That right there is a complete world script. Seems pretty lame. There's a lot that you can do with them because there's a ton of events. So before I really dive into how they work and the specifics, I'm going to show you how you can find events. We have the Denizen Dev chat room, which you'll see here. It's on Espernet, and I will definitely have a link in the description on how you can get on the web chat really easily so you can access all this real quick. McMonkey here has created a really handy thing called MonkeyBot. The MonkeyBot is a IRC bot that can read through all of our documentation in the code and help you find things. So in this case, we're going to use the command for an event, and we're talking about the death event. So when I search that, MonkeyBot responds with everything related to the on-entity death event. As you can see, it can also be called on-entity dies. Either way works, and it's triggered whenever an entity dies. So I guess the first thing, whoops, that's Facebook, sorry, wrong button. The first thing we're going to cover here is some variations of this event. You can have on-entity death, or as we showed, we had on-entity dies. That's a valid one. It does the exact same thing, it fires at the same time. Another one you can have is on player death. Now, this is still the same event, but we've specified the entity involved as a player. So the same event in the code fires, but it fires less often. It only fires when a player is killed. Another option would be on NPC death. So anytime an NPC is killed. Without actually checking, I'm going to tell you that I believe the sentry trait has this event built in, so this should function with the sentry trait, and it also functions with the Denizen health trait. So anyone who knows how to use either of those, basically, it should cover any form of a way you kill an NPC. The same thing applies. You can, narrate. Actually, we use announce for this one. So you announce to the server whenever someone dies, and a player died. So I'm just going to separate those. The spacing, you don't need to leave blanks in, but just for the sake of organization. So this is all good. This by itself, if we get rid of all this other stuff, would work. Every time a player died, it would announce it to the whole server. If you look at MonkeyBot's response, it shows you that this event has some contexts. And these contexts are tags which you can call inside of the event script to get information from the event. So, in this case, we have the context.entity. Oh, I did it again. Wrong one. Here we go. So, we're going to make this announce a little more personal. Instead of saying a player died, we can use context.entity. I think name should work. Okay, had to do a little fact check there. You can change this to .entity.asPlayer.name died. So that tag, while it does look confusing, is pretty straightforward. The context part refers to the information within the event. You then get the entity, which is, according to, I hit the wrong button again, according to MonkeyBot, context.entity returns the entity that was killed. So in this case, the player was killed. And we jump back. We want to make the entity object into a player, essentially. So we have entity.asPlayer, and then we get the name of the player. So, kind of confusing, but once you've put together a couple tags, they start to make sense. This is kind of a jumping in head first approach, so it's a little confusing. But every time a player dies, now it'll say the name of the player died. So that's pretty straightforward. Not too complicated. If we go back here, we can look at the rest of the contexts. There's context.cause, which returns the reason the entity was killed. I'm not entirely sure what that would return. I don't know off the top of my head. The damage is helpful because then you can know the amount of damage that it took to kill the entity. I believe that would give you the last hit that killed him. And then the damager is the next one that's relevant here. In this case, we'll assume that another player killed him. So if we go back to our script, we can say that the player was killed by context.damager.asPlayer.name. So what that would do is every time a player is killed, it would announce that the player was killed by the name of the player that killed them. You'll run into a small issue if it was killed by not a player, but put that aside for the moment. And then if they're killed by a projectile, you can get the projectile object. This is all kind of turning into how tags work video. But the idea is that a lot of events have context that you can access within the event to get information and check. So let's go back to the fact that this may cause an issue because this may not be a player. So we want to add a little bit of logic to this to check for that. So if context.damager, and this is where I'm going to use the tag search is player. You'll see here that we can use it. If we have an entity, we can check if it's a player by using .isPlayer as in the tag. So if the damager entity .isPlayer, so if this is the case, then we want to announce this. So we'll get rid of this and clean this up a little bit. Alright, so if the damager is a player, we then announce that the player was killed by the name of the player that killed him. So now we're using the if logic we touched on in the listener video. We're using some slightly complex tag usage, and we're using the context of the events. So you see how you can use these things together to produce all kinds of different results. The next really cool thing about events is this stuff. Here we go. Down here, the determine section. This particular event on entity dies has the opportunity to determine three different things. You can determine a string, which is some words to change the message from when they die. You can determine no drops to specify the player drops should be removed and the player won't drop anything. And you can specify a list of things that the player will drop. So let's go ahead and, just for complexity's sake and covering a couple more things, we'll do this drops option. So we switch to here, and under the if statement, we determine that the player, we use a determine command, and we determine, sorry, my mouse is getting there we go. We determine drops and then a list of items. So drops, and then we want to return a list here. I think I'm doing this properly. I'm sure McMonkey will scold me if I'm not. So we want to use determine, and then we use drops, and then we need to create a list of items that the player will drop when they die. And this is going to be in addition to their armor and their inventory. But if you want to use this to reward players for killing each other, you could add, we'll do diamond. So the player will drop a diamond and an item at, how about iron sword? So every time a player dies, so every time a player dies, they'll drop a diamond and an iron sword. So to elaborate slightly, determine allows you to alter the outcome of events. It allows you to define or determine what happens after the event takes place. And as MonkeyBot showed us in this example right here, where I searched for its event, we can determine the drops to specify new items to be dropped. And I gotta press the right button. So we're dropping this list of items. Now this probably looks confusing in itself. Just like we use tags and objects up here, we want to drop a list of item objects. So this right here represents a diamond in Denizen. The I@ is the item object fetcher, so the I@ diamond fetches a diamond object, we'll call it, within Denizen, so that Denizen knows to drop a diamond. And then the I@ iron sword gets an iron sword object for Denizen to drop. The pipe character just defines a list. So if we wanted to add a third thing, we add another pipe. I add, I don't know, glass. So drop a glass block. And so that's the basics of how to, use your context tags and use your determine command. We'll just go pick another random event and we'll play around with it a little bit just to be more thorough. If we go back into Denizen Dev here, we can use the event command, which I showed you, and basically search any part of a command you want. So if you're just thinking of an idea, you're like, I want, when the player mines a block, you can search player, and it'll show you all the events related to a player. Whoops. So you have player breaks block, player damages block, player places block. I mean, there's just a handful of them here. So just for the sake of example, we have player breaks block. So if we search event player breaks, it should pull up the specifics for that event. So you have a lot of options for aliases to break this down more, but we'll start with the basics here. So on player breaks block. So, we could do the basic thing we did before, announce a player broke a block. Alright, so that's pretty lame. Every time something breaks at all, it's going to announce that. So to make it even more interesting, we can return the material. So we have a player broke, context material. Oops. And I believe there's a tag that we need to add an additional thing here. Material. We search in here. We can get tag.material, and I think there's a name for it. Bukkit made of. Maybe I'm wrong. Okay, maybe material returns it. Oh, dot formatted, that's what I'm looking for. So we can do dot formatted, which will return a formatted name of the material. So every time a player breaks anything, it'll announce a player broke a glass block or a diamond ore, or, you have to put A there. So while still annoying, it at least tells you what the player broke. And then if you look further, we can get the location of it. So if we wanted to do something like at context.location, we can look at the options for location tags if we search tag location. And there's a ton of them, but there's this one right here called location.simple and location.simple formatted. So .simple.formatted will make it easy for the actual person to read. It's not going to return some funky Denizen formatted location. So again, still annoying, but it has information. We're using the information from within the event and displaying that to the player. We go back up here to the event. Let's say every time let's come up with a scenario and try to replicate it here. How about every time a player breaks an iron ore, instead of giving them an iron ore, we want to spawn a zombie. There we go. Let's do that. So every time an iron ore breaks, we want to cancel the drop and we want to spawn a zombie instead. So sticking to just this general on player breaks block, first thing we need to check is if the thing that was broken was an iron ore. Because if it's not an iron ore, then we want to disregard it because it doesn't matter. So we check if context dot material, let me double check, context dot material, Let's just make sure there's no other reference here. If context.material equals material at iron, equals material at iron ore, so that this returns an M at object. So if it returns M at iron ore, so material at iron ore, then we want to run this section of code. So we're going to make a slightly more elaborate if statement. Bear with me here. These I'll have to make a special video about, but it should make a little bit of sense in this context. So if this is true, which means if they broke an iron ore, the first thing we want to do is determine that we don't want it to drop. So in this case, on player breaks block, we want to determine nothing to make the block drop no item. So we determine nothing, and then we want to find the spawn command so we can spawn a zombie. So using McMonkey again, or MonkeyBot, we can search commands for spawn. In this case, it shows here that we have a spawn command to spawn an entity. It's very simple. We use spawn entity. So spawn zombie. Right? Yeah. Actually, I believe it'd be E at zombie. So it spawns a zombie, and then we need to set the location, which you'll see as an optional argument. We want to set the location at the context of the event dot location, which will then return a location for the spawn command. So we can then narrate to the player a zombie appeared, and now we've accomplished our goal. So if they break an iron ore, we want to not drop the iron ore. Instead, we want to spawn a zombie where the iron ore was, and then we narrate to him a zombie appeared, and now it's going to start attacking them. So you see how you can manipulate these events to produce completely different results. This is independent of any interact script that's going on. You don't have to assign a world event or a world script. You can just have a file that has your world script in it with all this different stuff going on that's independent of anything. But you can also incorporate world events into scripts. That'll probably be a second video. I have to refresh on that kind of stuff before I sit here and ramble about it. But I hope this gave you a good idea, or at least a basic idea, of how world events work, how world scripts work. And always remember, you can come back here and start using MonkeyBot to look up event information. I think you type just help. It shows you all the information MonkeyBot can give you. It's very helpful for people who are learning how to use Denizen. The searchable stuff here, you have tags, events, all kinds of stuff, commands, but specifically events we were talking about. We could search events for players, we can search events for entities, entity, there we go. You can do events if you want something related to items, apparently that doesn't exist, maybe item, there we go. So, if you're just thinking about something, search it, see if you can find something relevant. If you're looking at tag information, say you need help figuring a tag out for a player, you can type tag player, find out all the things you can use with player tags. You have item tags are extremely extensive also. There's all kinds of stuff. So use the bot to your advantage, and especially ignore him. He's a noob. But McMonkey's put a lot of work into making the bot really useful. So definitely utilize that when you're starting to delve into these more complicated things. Tags and events and actions and all kinds of fancy things. And if you ever have trouble with a command, we were using the if command. You can look up the information on the if, even though it doesn't really elaborate too much. I believe if you do, I could be wrong, if you will give you usage, except it's empty. So, well, have some faith. There is information to be had. So that's going to wrap up this tutorial. This was longer than I had planned on it being, but I think it's going to be really useful to people if I go on hiatus again and don't have time to work on this. So thanks again for watching. Subscribe, like, the usual, and hopefully I can get back to making some of these soon, now that I got a program that works pretty consistently. Alright, thanks guys.